Well, welcome everybody. This is William Brent, the Chief Marketing Officer of Husk Power Systems, a mini-grid developer active in Africa and Asia. Today, we're having a conversation on the potential for powering net zero growth in rural Sub-Saharan Africa. I wanted to start the session with a couple of high-level remarks and then introduce the esteemed members of the panel who are going to join the conversation and just sort of set the context. Or maybe I'll do that in reverse. I'll introduce the participants first, and then I'll get into the context. So first of all, there is Rim, if I say your name incorrectly, please let me know. Rim Azirar, who is the investment director at SunFunder. They're a leading debt provider for renewable energy and climate in Sub-Saharan Africa. Joan Chahenza is the Director of Energy Access Financial Advisory at the Africa Minigrid Developers Association, AMDA, which is the trade association representing the mini-grid industry. And Sandor Szabo is with the Joint Research Center Institute for Energy and Transport Renewable Energy Unit of the European Commission. I hope I got all of that right. If not, you can correct me in your comments later. So yeah, before we jump into the conversation, I wanted to just set the stage a little bit. I saw a statistic recently published by Wood Mackenzie that took my breath away, which was that at least, maybe more, 17 Sub-Saharan countries, Sub-Saharan African countries, have more distributed diesel generation capacity than grid-connected power generation capacity. And just think about that for a moment, right? That there at least 17 countries are generating more power using diesel generation than they are from the grid. So why is that? Essentially, it's a failure of the grid across Sub-Saharan Africa to meet the weak grid and unconnected areas of the continent. And as a result of that, there's been the creation of a huge diesel generation economy across Africa. And all of that is decades in the making. And it's not something that's going to be solved overnight, but especially as diesel prices are skyrocketing because of everything that's going on in the world right now. I think in Nigeria, prices have already doubled, if not more so. This is becoming a real issue. And it's not just an issue for energy access, right? My company works in communities where people are off-grid, but using diesel to power productive uses in agriculture and et cetera. But it's also for the weak grid, right? Where many of the small businesses in peri-urban and urban areas are also relying on diesel generation. So this is both a discussion around energy access and the role that net zero solutions like mini grids can provide. But it's also a discussion around energy transition and moving Africa away from a polluting, more expensive solution towards something that's more affordable, like the solar mini grid. So that's sort of the introduction that I wanted to provide. And I was hoping to sort of set the stage, starting with Sandor, to talk a little bit about the research that you and some of your colleagues did last year, I think it was, Sandor, that really tried to put some quantify in a more academic way, more rigorous way. What is the difference between the sort of economic cost benefit of solar mini grids versus diesel generation? And obviously, keeping in mind that your report came out before this huge hike in diesel prices. So some of the findings may be out of date, but I think even so, the findings are quite interesting. And I was hoping you could give a top line summary of that briefly.
Yeah, I will be very quick later if there are some questions. So you can imagine almost 60% of African population don't have electricity. They just simply not even diesel generators. Yeah. Then what you were saying, we have been doing this study comparing diesel generators and off-grid mini grid based on PV already from 2011. And already at that time, in many parts of Africa, it was cheaper. We just consider Africa as a huge continent. These diesel generators are very attractive because the upfront cost is very low. You buy the diesel generator at a very affordable price, but then later they become idle sometimes. They just cannot afford bringing the already expensive diesel, and the transport also is a problem. So in around 11, 12, it was a case when PV was cheaper. The PV costs were reduced, but we know that the diesel price is even more volatile. So there was time when obviously you cannot compete diesel, and in many countries they even subsidize diesel. Nigeria, Egypt, they sell the diesel at a less price than that cost to the country. So you can imagine this doesn't help. But now with the prices that and also these subsidies are removed, it looks like that in many countries, even the central organization recognized that diesel alone will not be the answer to the rural electrification. So they at least complement these systems with the PV, and now we see a booming market. Unfortunately, still very difficult to collect scientifically robust data to see it in every country. But we are doing now on-site research. We try to get performances of PV mini grids, and based on that, we will probably be able to refine even further what the real costs are, the PV provided electricity. And I'm quite sure, and I hope my colleagues who comes from the business part will also confirm this this view that more and more it comes to the picture. And if we manage to unblock all these barriers that are artificially sometimes put in the way of PV-based mini grids, I think the clear advantage of this will come, and the market will increase.
Yeah, thanks, Sandor. I want to get to the subsidy question a little bit later, but before we do that, I also wanted to just understand. I think if I recall correctly, in the report, there was basically a no-brainer scenario, right, for adopting solar PV mini grids versus diesel generation.
No.
Was there a conclusion about the size of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa where that no-brainer scenario would apply, where it'd be a no-brainer to do solar PV mini grids as compared to diesel generation?
Yeah, so in near 70% of the areas we identified, you cannot compete out PV mini grid, not even with diesel, but even with grid extension. You know, building a grid, it's also expensive. And I would see it a much better way than we did it in Europe. You build the central grid and you extend it. I think you build first the final mile of the systems, and then when you can afford, because you bring more income, you can connect it, and the two together can work very nicely. No waste of money. Sometimes when you build big lines, sometimes it's waste of money. You not connect enough people to the lines.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here, Sandor. So thanks for that's really great context, and I think it sets up the rest of the conversation really well. And I want to go to Rim, since you're basically a lender, right, who wants to avoid excessive risk when making those loans for project finance to build mini grids, right? And so I guess the first question I have for you is, when you're sort of assessing risk as an investor, how do you guys think about climate risk, liquid fuel volatility? Do you look at adaptation? Do you look at resilience? Do you look at mitigation? And are those things that you factor into your investment thesis, I guess is the question.
Sure. Hi, William, and hi, everybody. Well, the short answer is yes, definitely. SunFunder, at its core and sort of in its DNA and in its investment thesis, has climate adaptation and climate mitigation at its core. So it is not only part of our investment sort of criteria and the way we analyze a transaction, but it is also part of our eligibility conditions for a transaction to be even eligible for us for consideration. So, and that is because of the types of investors that we have crowded around to provide those financing that have at heart the climate crisis that we're all facing and the limited time that we have to find solutions that are both effective and scalable. Because what we're discussing about, and to Sandor's point on finding solutions that are cost efficient, that can scale, that we're putting in place infrastructure that are there to build the country's infrastructure on the long run, is definitely something that's top of mind when we look at an investment. But to your sort of more specific point, William, on adaptation itself, I think it's a rhetoric and it's a nexus that is relatively new in investors' community. We've more and more focused on mitigation just because the business case was clearer, but adaptation was always sort of an indirect sort of effect of the creation or renewable energy production as such. And there, you've mentioned, agricultural uses for the minigrid segments in the villages where Husk is, for example, present. Well, the agri-solar nexus for us is incredibly important. The food security that comes with it, the resilience of the population that's built, the gender angle also, because we're seeing mostly women being charged with those chores of getting access to water, clean cooking, etc. And that is all allowed thanks to a mini-grid, which is solar powered. So yeah, definitely top of mind for us and part of our investment criteria.
So just to dig into that a little bit more, when you say it's part of it, absolutely, I get that. But in terms of weighting, right? If you look at the sort of realm of different things that you're considering when evaluating, an application for project finance, is it something that doesn't rise to the top? And if it doesn't rise to the top, is there something that could happen from concessional finances, financial sources, or something else that would help rise to the top? Because, the UN Secretary General last year, at the beginning of the year, he came out very clearly and said that, half of climate finance needs to go towards adaptation. And he said of that climate finance, the majority needs to go to developing countries and to infrastructure investments in those developing countries, which makes sense, right? I mean, they're going to be the ones who suffer, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Who are going to be the most climate vulnerable, are the most climate vulnerable. That's a very sensible thing that he's calling for. But my sense is from what I'm seeing is that, climate finance isn't even close to being anywhere near this sector, right? There's a little bit coming in maybe from the Green Climate Fund and others in bits and pieces, but is there something that would help you as an investor and a debt provider move that up the consideration set when you're looking at investments?
Mm-hmm. Sure. For us, it's as I said, top of mind in terms of eligibility. But second, in order for it to be actually actionable, it has to be supported by business models that make sense. What we don't want to be doing is supporting business models that are unfortunately too weak to be able to be up to the challenge, exactly as you pointed out, William, of making a change in those communities that are most of the times the most vulnerable to climate change. And that has been highly documented and explained in detail as to why the sort of poorest and most marginalized communities are the most affected by climate change. So what does it mean that business models are viable? In the mini-grid space, as you certainly know, it does take time for those communities to generate the consumption that is generally commercially viable for most mini-grid developers, based on the cost that's involved on putting in place most of those mini-grids, servicing them in remote and rural areas most of the times, and that sort of demand uptake generally does take time, because you're talking about most of the times, and for most of those rural communities, about actually creation of a grid. We're not replacing a diesel central grid. It would be small and erratic systems that would be there, that would be replaced by the central grid that generally requires a load consumption which is significantly higher than what the population have been consuming so far. So that demand uptake does take time. So either through subsidy programs that can support that uptake, or through programs of demand stimulation. And when I say demand stimulation, I mean it in the most sort of fruitful and productive way, through systems that or assets that can be used towards agricultural productivity, for example, with mills. We've seen programs being piloted across the continent to see if those assets being sold to the communities help sort of trigger more consumption and thus more revenue for the communities, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is a sort of circle that allows more and more of those minigrids to be able to run at profitable levels in those communities.
Got it. Okay, so 2 follow-up questions very quickly though, and then I'll get to Joan. And then if anybody's listening then wants to ask questions, you can put them in the chat. But so the eligibility requirements as relates to climate mitigation and adaptation, are they specific to you? Is there an industry-wide agreement as to what those eligibility criteria are, and are they public?
Well, that's a good question, and maybe AMDA has has some ideas there, but no, we specifically in the adaptation segment for us, it is something that we're developing internally. So we're planning on having our next fund SFDR9 certified, and adaptation is one of the targets that needs to be complied with. So we're developing our own sort of frameworks and KPIs to be tracked. It's a difficult task because KPIs are different across the sectors. An adaptation KPI in agri-solar is different than in solar home systems, than in commercial and industrial, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to see what makes sense for each subsegment. And then, and it's also pulling out from of course, what we're hearing from the ground and what's doable from the companies like yourselves at Husk, et cetera, what can be collected and what are the effects actually on the ground that we can have an even more impact on by providing more financing. So
yeah,
it's a two-way.
Yeah, understood. You and I should talk because we're doing some work on that that could be interesting to collaborate on. And then the last question, just real quickly, do you currently have any pure climate finance limited partners in any of your funds? Like, has anybody from a pure climate finance lens invested in SunFunder to date? 100% climate finance.
What would you mean? So someone that doesn't have any kind of return expectative, but
no, just that some investors are more focused on infrastructure, some are more focused on renewable energy, some are focused, but like, my sense is that the pure play climate investors are still few and far between in our space. Is that not the case? Do you have any, would you say, pure play?
I'd say that we're seeing more and more. We don't currently have pure players, but I'm seeing more and more interest from investors in this specific subsegment, for sure.
Any names you want to mention?
I don't think we can, but hopefully in a couple of months.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. Okay, so thank you. And then, so Joan, obviously you're representing the private sector, including Husk, right? You're advocating for the mini grid industry with investors like SunFunder, but also more importantly, I think, with governments, and making sure that they're putting the regulatory and policy frameworks in place that allow our sector to scale, which they are starting to, but still have a long way to go, right? The World Bank says 200,000 mini grids are needed. We're at 19,000. They said we need $200 billion. We're at $5 billion. So there's a lot of work that organizations like AMDA can do to make that possible. We talked a little bit about agriculture and the role that could play. Rim talked about I think demand uptake and the importance of demand uptake. AMDA is going to be coming out with its second you call the benchmarking report that sort of looks at the health of the industry and progress that's being made. Are you seeing? So I'm asking about it because are you seeing the type of demand uptake applications that Rim was talking about starting to scale within the mini grid industry, right? Because the idea is that if those things do scale, you're going to be able to attract a lot more investment because the demand profile is there, and then hopefully that would then have a follow-on effect to be able to show climate resilience, climate adaptation, get more climate financing. So is there anything from this? I know it's not out yet, but are there any sneak peek tidbits that you can share in terms of increased demand from non-household users in Africa?
Yes, absolutely. So that's really a lovely question, and I really like the comments that were put across by Rim, and just the move, of course, for climate financing moving within the climate adaptation space, because of course we have seen in the recent past, a lot of focus being within the mitigation, and obviously there's this big concern in terms of moving that conversation and moving financing. However, having said that, obviously within the Sub-Saharan Africa market, we've seen only 2% of these, climate finance flows within the space. And of course, there's always this need to, push that to a little bit higher percentage, because then, this continent is in real need to be able to develop those robust systems to make sure that we are, creating a just transition and pathway. So having said that, correctly so, AMDA as a trade association, we do publish, data on the mini-grid space in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we are currently working on our second benchmarking report for the sector that will be out hopefully by mid this year. And what we've seen from the report, just on general observations before I come to your comment on the consumption, we have seen a growth in the sector. Right, so AMDA represents 86% of the market. These are 41 mini-grid developers who are spread across in 15 markets. And we are seeing, of course, the sector is growing, and we have seen that between the last time that we published in December 2019 and in December 2021, the number of connections going up radically from 40,000 reported in the last report to around 78,000. Which is really a good increase. And of course, these connections are powering households, they're powering hospitals, and we are seeing that the number of households and people connected are within the 500,000 mark. So having said this, we are seeing also the sites growing from 288 to around 400 in 2021. And we're also seeing very impressive growth in terms of ARPU. That meaning that the longer the mini-grid is actually in operation, so we are seeing also a corresponding increase in the revenues for the
right.
household.
So our ARPU is average revenue per user per month, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So in terms of consumption, in the current report, we have seen that 70% of the mini-grid consumer base actually consume less than 4 kilowatt units per month, right? This is really a very small usage, which of course should concern everyone. And we are seeing average monthly consumption, averaging around 6 units, so 6 kilowatt hours. And when you look at like the modern energy minimum, right? It's around 120 per kilowatt hour per month. So there's a lot of concern in terms of enhancing demand side management to ensure, households increase their consumption to move to where they are to, of course, the modern minimum. We are also observing that 13% of the customers, and this really addresses your question, are consuming between 10 to 35 kilowatt. And so this accounts for 50% of the consumption. So 13% of the customers, account for 50% of the consumption. And there is therefore need, of course, to grow the anchor loads to improve long-term sustainability of mini-grids. And we all know that, of course, with growing, the demand, then you get to spread your fixed cost over a higher platform. And we are really, encouraging and very supportive of demand simulation programs that target agro-processing, cold storage, electric milling, power sowing, and we do believe that this is very catalytic in changing what we are observing. So I'd like to sort of end by saying that even as we are looking at these demand simulation programs, we really need to focus in on, and especially financiers and sector players, on scaling up productive use efforts and move the narrative from just funding pilot projects, right, on limited geographical, that are very limited in terms of the geography and the jurisdictions that limit that collection of data that is multi-country. And we are really, advocating to scale up this initiative so that then we can have, comparison between, different jurisdictions, right? Mm-hmm. Also, we see that, scale will actually happen if we then move the funding to, sort of have the funding take the form of microfinance initiatives and move the burden of, and not really the burden, because mini-grid developers, of course, they are vertically integrated and they develop and also through the value chain and also offer productive use to scale up demand. But we'd like to see a market that has got service providers, a market that is supported. So, an ecosystem developing where we will see third parties taking up, these productive use initiatives and helping to scale up the demand.
Joan, does AMDA, we do as a company, but I'm wondering if AMDA does as an association track, because all of the things that we're talking about, these productive uses, at the end of the day, as Sandor's, talked about and I mentioned at the beginning, it's mostly powered by either diesel generation or gasoline generation, right? So is there an industry-wide number that's being gathered on an ongoing basis that talks about displacement of diesel generation? I'm asking that question because I'm going to come back to you in a second, Sandor, to sort of follow up with you about government's current perception, right, in terms of cost and affordability. And I think that, you have some interesting insights there. But Joan, I'm wondering, is that something that AMDA is tracking or plans to track?
Yes, so we are not currently tracking that. In fact, this year is a very first year where we've collected granular data in terms of consumption data that is actually aggregated per load consumed. So we do hope that we can move this, tracking and data to the next level, where we are looking at, displacing diesel using solar-powered equipment. And I know, Cross-Boundary Innovation Lab have actually done studies to just see, in terms of perception of displacement and how easy it is to displace solar, diesel electric powered appliances with solar powered appliances. And of course, those results have been varied. It's harder to convince someone who has a Porsche mill running on diesel to then be able to switch to solar due to maybe efficiencies of the solar product, and maybe just the fact that we have not reached to a place where we have robust systems that can do that. However, there's actually a need to move the conversation in that direction and to be able to track these productive use equipments and how they are displacing diesel.
Yeah, I mean, it's anecdotal, right? It's one company in the industry, but what we're seeing on average is that when we go into a community, we're seeing about a 25 to, let's say, 20 to 30% decrease in the number of diesel generator being used in the first, several months, right? That's considerable, right? I mean, we're planning on, we've pledged to offset avoid 700 million gallons of diesel by 2030. I mean, that's our big North Star, right? Is to be able to do that. But I think as an industry, it would be really helpful to have a consolidated number that we can show to investors, but also to the investors of those investors, especially from the climate space, and provide hard data. I think it's also really important to be able to show governments that not only are we creating a just transition, away from fossil fuels that provide even more savings and available cash for businesses to reinvest in their local economies, I think being able to show that as well is really important, to be able to have that as something that governments can look at and say, oh, okay, well, maybe this isn't such a great idea that we're supporting, continuing to support this diesel generation economy. But Sandor, I mean, so let me just also pause and just see if anybody else has any questions from the audience, or even within the panel that they want to raise. But if not, let me pause for a second and see if there are any questions. But I do want to talk to you, Sandor, about government. Okay, so let me just continue then. Sandor, I think in your report you talked about this general view that's focused within government, I think, which sort of then leads to subsidy, right? Which is that upfront costs are lower, right? Which they are, right? I don't know that. I mean, I don't know if upfront costs still are lower, for diesel generation, but you've made the point very clearly that lifetime costs are much more in favor of solar PV minigrids, right?
Yeah, I mean, with few exceptions where we saw it's not the solar was expensive, but it was so cheap, the diesel, it was because of subsidies. Then it was, yeah, this is the thing. Lifetime costs are lower for PV, but in these settings, then they say, okay, guys, you pay this, you will get the gadget, and then you have the electricity. But in long-term operation, we don't want to put. I mean, governments, put money into many projects, and later they didn't know whether they were functioning or not. We should avoid this. Yeah, we should put money in things that will provide the electricity. I think that's a good point for PV, because the diesel, if it becomes expensive, no one will pay for putting more diesel into the genset. Yeah, that's an advantage. On the other hand, yeah, you have to persuade that you have to see the overall lifetime cost. And I saw the point in the SunFunder. I think it's very important that when you size the system, that you really have a future consumption. You should not go for the very small consumption, because sometimes many government programs end up financing standalone solar home systems, but they a little bit lock in options, because they provide certain energy services. No way that you cannot say, yeah, it's based on PV, it's clean, but it can be blocking the future way. And mini grids can be upscaled, can be modular. If you set up the system, it can provide more electricity. It can. So there, I see that you need to have some gunpowder for the government to put the money there. I see they try to put the money. You mentioned all these things. I think one of the things we have to work. I was told, and maybe SunFunder can confirm, it's easy to found a solar standalone system. They sell it like a product. Why you are selling a mini grid? It's already an investment. Yeah, so there are certain risks that come in. It's not a product you sell, but it's really an investment. You have to justify the demand, the consumption, and things like that. Which makes it a little bit more risky. That's where we have to work. If government jumps in with the money that would reduce these risks, I think we could maybe swing the balance from the standalone system type of product selling to this more systematic investment. And I think, yeah, there we have to work. And I hope this climate funding, but also other, many pledges there are. The developed world will spend money on energy in Africa. I hope we can find a way that they will really de-risk this kind of investments in mini grids.
Yeah. One point that I wanted to pick up on, just touch on briefly, is that I think A2EI, which is another research organization that looks at this sector, they found that despite the challenges with diesel, they were idle for quite a lot of the time, right? That they weren't actually being used, right? So the upfront cost is cheaper, but then you're actually not using it to its full capacity either, whereas a mini grid is much more flexible.
And just one example, in Kenya, when we found there were some 20 minigrids, the governments were financing them, but out of them, 90% was diesel, fully diesel fueled. 2 years later, because we said our calculations don't show it's a good choice. 2 years later, they came back, and all of them they put at least a bigger PV array into the diesel-based system. And I think it was a simple government finance system. I think this is the way it will evolve. We need to happen it faster, and we need to avoid that they put this money into the wrong system.
So how do we accelerate that transition, right? I think that it's a combination of the three legs of the stool, right? It's finance, it's government, and it's private sector readiness to do all of those things. Seems to me that as long as there's subsidy in the system, I mean, there's subsidy for mini-grids in Nigeria, for example. So it's not as if there aren't any subsidies for the sector, but in many markets, there's heavy subsidization of diesel and very little, if any, subsidy for mini-grids. So I think there has to be some sort of level playing field across the continent. And so, Joan, we talked about sort of aggregating better and more data around this, but what do we need to do? And this is a question for all of you, but what do we need to do to get subsidy either to be level between different solutions, right? So that one's not favored over the other, or just to do away with it, right? And so you're competing head to head on a purely market basis. What needs to happen as an industry for that to happen?
So this is really, a subject that I'm very passionate about, in terms of just making sure that we are viewing, all these different options from the same lens, because subsidies are still being applied for, of course, diesel generators, both grid tied and and also just the diesel itself, right? And if you're, in any part of Sub-Saharan Africa, in the last few months, there's been, of course, shortage of fuel, high fuel prices. We are cognizant of the fact that some households in Sub-Saharan Africa use fuel, so paraffin for lighting and kerosene for cooking. And so when you're looking at it from the perspective of, subsidies being imposed on this lighting and kerosene, fuel, then of course there's the angle of creating a safety net for the urban poor who use kerosene for cooking and those who are at the bottom of the pyramid. But having said that, the question always remains, right, whether this is a most efficient way of allocation of resources, and definitely is also a concern around the market signal that you get to put out there, right? Because subsidies should send a market signal to the market, right? And subsidies should have a clear sunset clause, so they should be applied not indefinitely, but with a clear entry and exit strategy. So in terms of what you've said in terms of leveling the playing field and looking at subsidies that are being put within the grid tied space or within the distributed diesel generator space and the mini grid space, I guess the key considerations is, number one, is are we pricing the externalities of pollution? Definitely we are not. And if we were to do that, I would imagine that the cost of diesel would not be as attractive, right? It might have been attractive a couple of years back, right? And borrowing from.
Yeah, but I mean, we don't. But I think what I'm hearing, Joan, just to sort of interject here for a second, is that we don't even need to price the externalities, right? I mean, what I'm hearing from Sandor is that it's a slam dunk, right? Just based purely on economics. Solar PV mini grids beat diesel, right? So if it's just
but it would help to put some money at the beginning of the investment from other funds, right? Because then even with the upfront cost, it would be a big help. Yeah.
Right. So my question, I guess, to get more specific, Joan, is what needs to happen, right? Do we try and get governments to take this pot of money that they're using to subsidize diesel and slowly move it, or not so slowly, move it over to, solar PV mini grids, or is there some other mechanism that's been considered, or, and RIM also for you, what would be, would that be a positive signal from an investor and debt provider perspective to see that transition happening? I guess question for both Joan and RIM. I'd be
absolutely. So I was getting there. So in terms of what needs to happen is government needs to ideally create incentive mechanisms, right? Mini grids, the way they are right now, obviously do need some subsidy for them, for the unit economics to ideally make sense. And this is really a place where, government can actually come on board and put in funding that is being directed to emergency power plants, right? Standby, gas-powered turbines and diesel generators, right? So these subsidies can actually be reallocated to a mini grid fund, some incentive mechanisms that then can be used to power green mini grids within, and especially for countries that have got very low electrification, right now currently. Because what we have seen is that mini grids actually provide a least cost electrification pathway for rural households, right? And for governments to actually, and governments and developing partners to be able to have that consideration where we actually putting in subsidies that will then translate to lower prices, right, for the rural end consumers who, of course, where you really need to look at the willingness and ability to pay in terms of, as considerations for the rural households. So I do agree with you. I don't have maybe a methodology of how that would actually happen. But
I do. Let's make one up. Okay. Let's create one. I think we need to create one. Yeah, let's make that happen. That should be. We should all come together and figure out a plan to actually make that materialize. Rim, what's your thoughts on that? You've been listening quietly for a little while. Any thoughts specifically on sort of reallocating subsidy? How would an investor sort of look at the market if that were to happen? Would you see that as a significant signal? What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, let's first acknowledge that SunFunder is there to finance a portion of this energy access gap, but the financing needs are huge. I think we've all looked at those reports, and the latest being probably the IEA that states that I think it's 13 billion for mini grids only, and for Sub-Saharan Africa only. These are just Sub-Saharan Africa figures. Yeah. It's huge. So I do think that there's a problem on the financing side and the funding side, but as you said, William, it's the entire package that needs to come together. It's the enabling environment. And I know that AMDA has been also working on the licensing part. There is a question around how to facilitate licensing for mini grids because they're in most geographies facing the same type of sort of constraints that multi-hundred gigawatt sometimes plants face. So that's just not economically feasible for developers that have multiple number of much smaller scale mini grids. So all of that has to come together. To your specific question on what can be done on subsidies, and to your you preaching for us to create something new. Well, we've seen subsidies being mostly RBF based, so really focusing on that construction period. So being either milestone based until the construction is done, or pure RBFs or result based financing. Sorry. So being received by the developers at the commissioning stage. Well, can't we imagine another bucket of money that would then kickstart at commissioning to support the uptake of that demand that's so critical for mini grids to be viable over the long run, either by, for example, subsidizing the appliance programs that Joan has mentioned and the productive use sort of build up in those communities, or would it be through we can think about ways to first stimulate demand, but second also create that enabling environment for mini grids to actually deploy even more connections in the communities where they are active, because to Joan points on consumption patterns and the fact that there is generally anchor loads, so customers that consume most of the loads, but the rest of the community generally doesn't have access to a grid that's actually a few meters away from their homes, etc. All of that can be thought through. So yeah, maybe a program that kickstarts after the commissioning, for example.
I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion around operational subsidy, if you want to think about it that way, right? I mean, essentially, it could be demand side, it could be supply side, either one. But I think it's a really interesting thought. I think, as well as I would say, it's interesting to me in part because, well, I lost my train of thought, but it is an interesting thought. So I think. I think where I'm heading with some of the comments from all three of you is that, there's a need for more direction from the industry, both for investors, for governments, that puts some serious thought and data as much as possible behind why it's in everybody's interest. It's in the government's interest in terms of saving money and letting the private sector come in and take away some of that subsidy that they would otherwise be spending, or reusing it in a more sustainable, more economic development oriented way. It's good for investors who are going to see that as an opportunity to come in and do more. And it's good for private sector players as well, right? Because we would benefit from that transference of subsidy or support from one thing to the other. And I think at the end, but most importantly, it's a benefit to the consumer, right? The person who's actually consuming diesel powered generation. I mean, you've been in, like I have, in rural communities in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's terrible, right? I mean, these things are loud. They're polluting, and now they're so expensive, right? Just to sort of run them on a day-to-day basis. So, I think it's a win-win-win for us as an industry, and I think it's untapped as something that we should focus on. So I'm also seeing a message from Robin Reed, who's asking about potential for job creation in this area. Employment opportunities that might come along with increased investments in mini grids across Africa. I mean, I've done a lot of work on the issue of jobs. I'm happy to weigh in, but Sandor, Joan, any quick thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Sandor. So job creation definitely is a pertinent topic to discuss. Obviously, as mini-grid developers, over and above just providing electricity to then be able to power households, the element of job creation is really important. And having said that, from the benchmarking report, we have seen that in the year 2020, from the number of sites that were deployed, we have seen, jobs, an increase in jobs, and what is actually being reported is the number is around 900 jobs were created in that year. So there is need to ideally make sure that these jobs are, actually permanent jobs, and that we're actually seeing, the effects of job creation being felt within these communities, and of course within the local, the local communities where these mini grids are being deployed. And so it's really exciting to see job creation in this regard. However, we need to move one step higher and make sure that there's actually a transfer of knowledge, so tacit knowledge in terms of operation and maintenance, and making sure that we're actually empowering the local youth to be able to do, operation and maintenance tasks, and actually transferring some of the value chains that can be done, within mini-grid development to local households, to then be able to have that long-term effect.
Great, thanks, Joan. Sandor, you want to come in real quick?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that, of course, in a developing setting, it has a much bigger employment impact than in a country like Europe. You replace employment, but here when you build new things, it's much higher. It has a very important gender dimension as well, because the local communities usually women would be a core in maintaining the system and to show the interest and maintaining the demand and things like that. What I wanted to follow, William, what you were asking, how to move this whole thing, because all this, and I think Rim and Joan already touched upon. For us from the European context, we will try to draw the attention that if you put money into energy, we try to combine it with social infrastructure. So many hospitals, schools, they don't have electricity. You can imagine, we were discussing, Rim mentioned this encore load. You can imagine if, because governments are, how to say, it's easier to direct money to social infrastructure development things. If you can use this social infrastructure like local, not hospital, but even a health center that they give vaccine and things like that. You want to have a fridge, you want to increase, the blood sampling, medicines, things like that. I think this would be a nice model. So from our part, we try to also include this dimension that maybe the finance, what you can get from public finance, this social infrastructure, and easy it, the private companies can build it up, and we can rely on this anchor load, because these are places where you have bigger load. And then the surrounding communities could get the electricity, and then it can develop together. I think this is one model. And also that could help with the the organization you mentioned, William. We are trying to work on these lines. So I think there we have to find these common ways how to make this risk seen lower, and also to make these things happen faster. I think that's, from my side, I would close here. But okay. I really wonder whether Rim and Joan could agree on something, some such schemes.
Absolutely. With William's permission, I'd also like to say that in terms of moving the conversation forward and ensuring that there's actually a pathway, a least cost pathway, right, that does not pollute the environment, and that is and that is environmentally friendly. So governments should ideally ensure, obviously, integrated renewable energy plans, and that consider least cost electrification pathways for different consumers, right? You can't connect everyone to the grid. And, so there are certain consumers who it would just be, more efficient to connect them to mini grids or solar home systems. Number two, in my long laundry list, ensure policy and regulatory landscape, of course, that enhances private sector participation. Rim talked about licensing and compliance regulations. We cannot have licensing and compliance requirements that are not commensurate with the size of the mini grid development. Governments need to allow for batch applications, automation. Obviously, we've talked about subsidies. If there can be a reallocation of these subsidies to those that are the standby emergency power plants. Subsidies allocated to diesel plants. If this can be channeled to, of course, grid-tied solar solutions or subsidies for the mini grid development, that would be, I would imagine, more long-term efficient and way of looking and creating a path, some standardization within the market. Also, allowing and having an enabling environment where mini grids can be interconnected with the grid, support electrification, especially for utilities that are struggling, right, to remain afloat. There can be a mechanism where the private sector obtains concessions, operates under the grid for development of mini grids, in this state distribution, with, of course, in conjunction with the state distribution companies. So I'll end it there.
So, Joan, thanks. I mean, I agree 100% with everything you just said. Where I think we fall down, and this is just to get back to one of the points I was making earlier, is that all of these things are going to, make government officials turn blue in the face. They're going to fall or fall asleep, one or the other. I'm not sure which one. We need, as an industry, a very simple to understand narrative that paints a very clear picture for why it's in the government's interest to do what you're talking about, right? And that's what I'm trying to get at, which is, how does the investment community, the academic community, the private sector work together to come up with that narrative, and then, continue to press governments to understand it first and foremost, and then based on that understanding, then they'll take the actions that you're talking about, Joan. But first, I think they need to see what that they would need to understand the narrative. That's how humans, deal in the world, right? We're a narrative species, right? And I think same with the climate investment community, Rim. And we only have a couple minutes left. And so I want to sort of circle back to that because I think they need something as well that's not only narrative, but also data driven. And, the mini-grid industry needs to really, not just as one individual investor or one individual company, as a sector, figure out what we're trying to communicate, how we're helping the climate investment community quantify our benefit, right? So Rim, I want to sort of turn it back to you and give you one last chance to sort of reflect on that and see if there's anything else that you would suggest to make that happen. Because I do think that climate finance is going to be a really important component to the scaling of this industry. So any last thoughts from you, Rim, on that?
Yeah, no, I agree, William, with the need for a clear and straightforward narrative. And the way we've seen it in other subsegments of the industry is through case studies. So one suggestion could be, let's take one case study, either at the scale of a country or a scale of a region, or something that would be sizable enough for decision makers to understand and grasp, and show the data that supports the rhetoric that we're all preaching on climate change, that it's a no-brainer from a cost perspective, that the communities live better, et cetera, et cetera. There, I would really call out sort of AMDA and you guys, and sort of try to identify what should be the best way of approaching this. Is this at the country level? William, you did mention Nigeria earlier, that has sort of a fantastic program in place already, an enabling environment with the regulation that's in place and that's been drafted with the support of the World Bank, notably. So would that be the example that we all collectively take as an industry, and sort of draw conclusions, both on what's working well and also the challenges, and how to make it even better, faster, in order for it to scale? Because I think that we all know that program is fantastic, but also, of course, because it's so innovative, is not perfect. So
yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that's great, Rim. I didn't mean to cut you off. Were you done? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sure. We're at the top of the hour.
yeah, good. So, and so Sandor, what I just heard there was also for me a message to academia that there's additional room for research here. And I think all three of us, Joan, Rim, and I, would be happy to help shape any additional research you want to do, and even help you find the funding to do it. So let's not end that there. So I think we are at time. I would love to continue this conversation. So thanks to Catalyst 2030 for allowing us to organize the session. Sandor, Joan, Rim, thank you all three very, very much. So great to get your perspectives, and I'll be sure to follow up with you on some next steps.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, William.
Much.